and also representing the Faculty Excellence Committee today. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this Convocation and Faculty Excellence presentation. So I will introduce our speaker today. Dr. Hannah Lynn Venable works in ethics and in continental philosophy. Her articles have appeared in the journals Foucault Studies, Religions, Journal of Speculative Philosophy, and Philosophy and Theology. Her book, Madness and Experience in History, Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology and Foucault's Archaeology, was recently published by Routledge, and it will be for sale after this presentation, just out these doors. Okay? She has taught at the University of Dallas, Texas State University, and Trinity University, and is now an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Mary. So, on behalf of the Faculty Excellence Committee and Convocation Committees, I present Dr. Venable with a University of Mary Faculty Excellence Award, which she has won for her work. Please welcome her.
Good morning, everyone. It is such an honor to present my work to you today. I have been blessed by the community here at the University of Mary for now a little over a year. Being asked to give this convocation is really just another example of the support and respect that I have experienced here, so thank you. So, as Dr. Stewart mentioned, my presentation today comes from the research that is now published in my new book, Madness and Experience in History, Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology and Foucault's Archaeology. This book is based on my dissertation that I wrote at the University of Dallas and also includes research done at the Institut Catholique during my year of living in Paris. So if this convocation perks your interest, as Dr. Stewart mentioned, I will have copies of my book available afterwards. So my project starts with the idea that a pure medical model isn't sufficient in providing an understanding of madness or mental illness. To illustrate this, I would like to introduce you to a woman named Marilyn. After living in hospital since her early 20s due to severe schizophrenia, Marilyn was moved at the age of 52 years old to a smaller care home. Here she met Louis Phillips, a mental health care nurse, who cared for her with the help of the other staff at the home. But Marilyn exhibited some pretty challenging behaviors. She frequently refused to bathe or shower. She would urinate in front of open windows. She carried around bags of paper that were her treasured possessions. Her relationship with her family appeared strained. After her mother would visit her, she would kind of laugh and slap herself and say, "Naughty girl." According to Phillips, the nurse, the staff at the home were most concerned with fixing Marilyn's behaviors to encourage proper hygiene and general cleanliness, but that they didn't stop to consider her lived experience and understand her behavior on a deeper level. The staff also did not consider the social or historical pressures on her, such as those of her family. Phillips wonders how their care might have been better for Marilyn if they could have reflected on some of these experiential and social factors. The case of Marilyn reveals that when we rely completely on a medical model of mental disorder, we excel at managing behavior and meeting physical needs, but we might miss the deeper motivations and influences behind the behavior. So how do we address this? Well, there's lots of different ways. But I believe that to understand mental illness on this sort of deep level, we need to consider two diverse perspectives. The perspective from human experience and the perspective of human history. Now, no one's going to deny that these individual perspectives are important. But what I'm arguing is that these two approaches have to be intertwined. We have to see them as complementing each other. And this is actually the key to a deeper understanding of mental illness. My claim is that we must integrate human experiences of madness with the history of madness in order to have a full account of mental health and to make possible more holistic care. And really, this isn't just to illuminate better health care. What this project ultimately points to, as I'll mention a little at the end, is the value and dignity found in many diverse human experiences, not just those of mental disorders. Let me introduce to you now to sort of these two approaches that I'm putting forward. So this first approach from experience comes from phenomenology. Phenomenology literally means the study of phenomena, and it's an investigation of phenomena, or the true appearances of the world. Phenomenology rests on the human's perspective of and relation to the world. Maurice Merleau-Ponty, 1908 to 1961, was a French philosopher who expanded the ideas of phenomenology and existentialism, especially due to his consideration and his work in psychology. Merleau-Ponty sees that it is only as a human that we understand the world, and it's only as a human that we have access to knowledge. So this is where my approach from experience really draws from. In order to understand madness or mental disorder, I turn to this sort of lived human experience. Now, you might ask, does that just make it all subjective? If you're looking at mental disorders based on sort of personal experience, does that just make it subjective? Well, it is subjective in a sense that all these experiences are based on a human subject. But what phenomenology demonstrates is that there are general truths that come from a common human way of experiencing the world. Okay, my second approach is from history. And this comes from Michel Foucault, who is another French philosopher. His date's 1926 to 1984, and he was actually a student of Merleau-Ponty. He trained in phenomenology, but his work is more in areas of postmodernism and post-structuralism. His approach of archaeology is analogous to trying to dig up and study places and artifacts of human history in a philosophical way. Foucault sees his method as a way of excavating the hidden structures that support the cultural institutions and practices. But rather than repeating sort of the mainstream history of psychiatry, Foucault wants to dig up the structures that are found in the gaps of that history, in the places that have been silenced. So this is where my approach from history comes from. Foucault's archaeology of madness is particularly historical because he relies on historical records of events, documents, and accounts that relate to madness. But this is not the history that we're usually told. It tells a different story, an untold story about the origins of psychology. And what we learn from this history is not just sort of a set of interesting trends, but it reveals to something about where we have come from and why we are in the place that we are today. So based on these two approaches, I'm going to put forward sort of three insights that I think we can use by thinking of these approaches together. And I'm going to point to how they expand our view of mental illness and help us avoid some drawbacks of modern psychology. So what are some of the pitfalls of modern psychology? Some of them are extreme individualism, a stark division between normal and abnormal, and mental illness as only biological sickness. Now, I just want to make an aside to those of you who are in psychology. If you're here at this presentation, you're probably already aware of some of these pitfalls. And there are many in psychology that I've talked to that are sort of aware of these and are working to sort of combat these. And so I want to say that that's definitely present. But when I talk to people that are in psychology, they say, we're a minority voice. We need more sort of tools and approaches to help us with this. So hopefully this is one way to do that. Okay, so before I jump into these three insights that combat these pitfalls, I need to define a couple of terms. First of all, madness. Madness, I define as a state of brokenness in mental and bodily capacities. And we don't usually use the term madness anymore for mental disorders. But I use that term partly because it's in the literature, but also because it kind of contains these colloquial meanings, which remind us of the broadness and the ambiguity of human experience. And that's what I'm really looking for, this sort of more general idea of madness, in order to make sense of what we now call either mental illness, mental disorder, or psychopathology. I'm also going to be using the term non-rational a lot. And to understand the idea of non-rational, I start by seeing how rational and non-rational are linked. So the rational, according to the accepted modern understanding derived from the Latin ratio, it means something that has reason, something that has explanation, order. So then, correlatively, the non-rational is something that's deficient or lacking in reason, explanation, or order. And I really see the non-rational as manifesting in 4 ways: pre-rational, irrational, super-rational, and unrational. I'm not going to go into those 4 ways, but just so you know, there's sort of different ways the non-rational manifests in human experience. But the important thing is to see that this non-rational and rational are linked, and we'll talk about that more in a second. Okay, first insight that I think can be gained by putting together this idea of experience and history and thinking about madness or mental disorder. History expressed in experience. And I have under here, rooting historical structures in phenomenological experience. I believe this first insight can help us avoid the pitfall of extreme individualism. Now, where does this individualism come from? Part of the modern psychological project is an increased attention to individual care, right? This includes one-on-one counseling sessions, tailored treatment plans, lots of different things, right? And these are all great. These are all really great things. But the problem with the radical individualism is that it locates the source of a mental disorder only in the individual, and it places the primary responsibility on the individual to be cured. Throughout a study on the history of madness and an analysis on individual experience, we can combat this bias in psychology by exposing how community, present and past, contributes to the ways that mental illness is defined and diagnosed. So there's a lot of historical structures that we can consider to think about this, and today I'm just going to present one. The historical structure that I'm going to talk about, if we think about trends from the 16th century onward to today in Europe, there's a trend that pops out, and that is that madness tends to be defined by the cultural perception of the rational. I'll say that again, and I'll say what I mean by that. Madness tends to be defined by the cultural perception of the rational. This historical reliance on the rational to define madness gains further validity, so that's sort of the historical standpoint, right, what we understand from history, but it gains further validity when we see how it is grounded in the phenomenological principle that there is rational access to madness through human experience. In reflecting on experience, we see how the use of reason gains an entrance to madness because madness already contains in itself meaning and intelligibility. In other words, just by being human, we can understand and make sense of to a certain extent, mental disorder, just by being human. This is owing to the fact that madness is not separate from the human, but is an integral part of the human experience, arising out of it and being central to it. Okay, so let's consider the historical side of this first. Oops, did I miss something? There we go. Let's take, for example, how madness is viewed in the classical age. These are some sweeping generalizations that I'm going to use here, but I think you can follow it here. So in the classical age, roughly the 17th to 18th centuries, what's the understanding of the rational? Well, if you were a rational person, then you were also a moral person. Thus, madness as displays of the non-rational, right, would then be immoral. Someone considered mad was judged to be evil and deserved to be locked away. And this resulted in this great confinement that took place in Europe during the 17th century, where lots and lots of people were locked away. What about the modern age? Well, in the modern age, which I'm considering sort of 19th century to present, what is rational is now shifted to what's normal. And then madness or mental disorder is what's abnormal. Modern rationality tells us that madness is actually something that can be fixed and controlled through scientific treatments and medications. How does this relate then to our side of experience or phenomenology? Phenomenologically, we find that the cultural tendency to define madness according to a certain kind of rationality comes from the actual ability of the individual to make sense of madness. So I want to look at this crucial passage here. This is from Merleau-Ponty's Phenomenology of Perception. And he says that madness, perception, other experiences of the non-rational, despite all their differences, are not self-enclosed. They are not islands of experience without any communication and from which one cannot escape. They open onto a horizon of possible objectifications. Although experiences of madness are different from what is expected, they are not cut off from common experience. They provide connections among humans and reveal a shared horizon of human experience. Because the individual can understand madness to a certain extent through one's rational capacity, it then follows, going back to our historical look, that society as a whole will continue to try and define madness by its perceived understanding of the rational. So here's just an example of how we can sort of understand experiences of madness or mental disorder. Think of two experiences: experience of an hallucination and experience of homesickness. Now, we'll think of hallucination as something that's sort of abnormal, right? Part of a mental disorder. Homesickness, we would think of as normal. And yet, both of these things have this experience of sort of non-objective space, okay? So think about this. If you're having a hallucination, you're not feeling that you're present in the physical space that you're in because there are also other objects or people that you see that are there, okay? What about homesickness? It's a similar thing that goes on. When you're homesick, you don't really feel like you're in the space that you're in. You actually feel like your heart and your thoughts are back in another space. Now, certainly an experience of hallucination is a more extreme experience of non-objective space, but it's coming from that same pattern of the way that we experience space is not strictly objective. It's the way that humans experience space. Connecting the significance of the rational and individual experience with the historical practices allows us to see the way both the individual and society take part in the construction of mental illness. We can do the same thing with thinking about the non-rational. So we can look at historical structures of a non-rational and how that links to experiences of the non-rational in the human. And I don't have time to do that today, but you can do that in a similar fashion. We will talk about that a little bit in a third point. Okay, so let's go now to the second insight. So first insight is looking at how history is expressed in experience. The second insight is beyond the rational and non-rational divide. This second insight can help us avoid the pitfall of a stark division between the normal and the abnormal. Remember, that was our second pitfall that we talked about, this division between the normal and the abnormal. Now, where does this division come from, this division between abnormal and normal? To make sense of mental disorders, our modern world often makes this stark contrast between here's our normal, healthy people over here, and then those that have diagnosis, the abnormal and the sick over here, right? Strange behavior of people with mental disorders is explained on the grounds, well, they're sick, right? They can't conform to the normal standards of society. We're putting them over here in this category. But this problem, this division, goes even deeper. Those that are seen are abnormal due to mental illness are then also seen as somewhat not rational, right? They're kind of lost some of the rationality, maybe non-rational. And this can lead to a dehumanizing effect on those diagnosed with mental disorders. If the primary identity for the human is rationality, then those who are considered non-rational or have a lot of not rational elements to them may be seen as less human. By seeing the relation, which I'm arguing for here, between the rational and the non-rational, we can break down this division that's often between the normal and the abnormal. Okay, so looking at it from the experience standpoint. Oops. Yeah, we got that. Okay. We begin by seeing that the human participates fully in each action as a whole being. And here's what Merleau-Ponty writes here. He says, we need to treat the human subject as an indivisible consciousness that is wholly present in each of its manifestations. And the French there for the indivisible consciousness is une conscience indécomposable. And that word indécomposable, it means something that can't be divided into parts. Can't be taken apart or separated. It's inséparable, you can't separate it, and it's non-fragmentable, it's not fragmented. The indivisible consciousness acts as the unbroken function of the human to go after meaning or purpose. It accomplishes the fluid integration of the rational and the non-rational in the human. Habits are a really great example of this. So think about a habit. When you do a habit, you are doing something non-rational to a certain extent, right? You're doing something without thinking. It's almost as if your body is sort of guiding you in something when your mind is not at the moment guiding you. And yet habits are rational in another sense too, right? Because each habit is oriented toward a certain goal or meaning. I mean, think about, why are you driving your car? That's a habit, right? But to get to your destination safely. Why are you playing your instrument? Well, because you want to play beautiful music. There's goals already built into the habit, even if you're not thinking about them in the moment. If this is sounding kind of teleological, then good, because there is something here that's teleological. Not all phenomenologists are going to say that, but it's there. There's this phenomenological sense of telos, or purpose, that's sort of present in human behavior. This relation between the rational and non-rational is present even in cases of mental disorder. And this is really critical. We like to put experiences of mental disorder in the non-rational category. But we just saw that the rational and non-rational are in normal experiences. And what we're going to find in experiences of madness, we also have this relation between the rational and the non-rational. Think about an example of a man, he's diagnosed with schizophrenia, he's having a hallucination that he's talking to somebody next to him, okay? He's walking along, he's talking to them. Well, that's not very rational, right? There's nobody there. You shouldn't be talking to him, right? But actually, he does have a reason for talking to that person. What's his reason? He sees somebody there. So there is a reason that's sort of based on something that's not true, but it is then as resulting in his behavior. So even in these extreme cases, we see the rational and the non-rational present. Thus, the indivisibility of the human is confirmed both in studies of normal and abnormal behavior. We can't define mental illness just as a complete loss of rationality, because we see that there's a presence of the non-rational and rational in both. Okay, let's think about it from the perspective of history. Here's a chart. I won't go through all of it, I promise. Okay, so Foucault sort of creates this milieu of madness, and he goes through this history of Europe and talks about these trends, and I've put together kind of a chart of looking at that. Foucault's milieu of madness, he begins in the age of Renaissance. If you look at the top of the chart, you can see there's these three ages that he has. You have Renaissance, classical, and you have modern. Okay, and then underneath it you have the characteristics. So it begins in the Renaissance, and if you look under perception of, I have irrational there because, like I mentioned, it's one of the forms of the non-rational. There's a perception of irrational. What do we see? It's dark, tragic, illusory, but necessary. And that is in contrast to something that is rational, the light, the sacred, the real. And then look, do you see kind of in the middle of the chart, you have the relationship between rational and non-rational. If you look under the Renaissance, there's a relationship there. There's a dynamic relationship between them. There's sort of a back and forth, a giving and taking. They're both necessary for each other. If you go to the classical, you have the perception of the rational as moral. We talked about that already. The perception of irrational as immoral, nothingness. There's still a relationship there. They're separated, they're divided, but they're sort of both present there. What happens, though, is that the non-rational starts getting hidden away in the classical age. Remember, I told you, anyone who seems to be mad or evil gets locked away. It gets hidden away in the classical age. And because of that, it's eventually forgotten. As a result, in the modern age, the mad are viewed not as tragic wanderers, as in the Renaissance, not as immoral outsiders, as in the classical, but as abnormal individuals in need of medical aid. So when we arrive at the modern age, we seem to hit an anomaly in the pattern. While both of the previous ages relied on some interaction between the rational and the non-rational, in the modern age, where's the non-rational? It seems like we can't find it. Because modernity loves the rational so much, loves the objective, loves the scientific, loves the normal, it suppresses the non-rational, allowing it to be alienated, exiled, and silenced. So you see there under perception of the irrational, alienated, exiled, silenced, and then what's the relationship there? You just kind of see the rational. There's just the priority of the rational there. the non-rational is then sort of reduced to silence. But Foucault argues that the great silent wounds within man are still there in the modern age. And that word wounds is the French déchirement, and it has this idea of being torn, ripped, broken. And this is still present in the modern age, and it pops up in places. He says it pops up in strange events at mental institutions, at artistic expressions, and experiences of patients. And I just have one example here. Here's an example of what Foucault sees as sort of modern art depiction. We've said that madness is just a medical condition, but our art seems to tell us otherwise. What do we have in this picture here? Kind of strange, right? You've got the person holding his head, feeding himself, and then a funnel where his head should be. Okay, and it's called the Grand Desperate, Grand Folly by Francesco Goya. So we still see these things of madness seems to be a disturbance and a dark thing here that we don't talk about, but it comes up in art. Okay, so it's no coincidence that both a study of experience and a study of history point to the integration of the rational and the non-rational and help us steer clear of making a stark division between them. As we saw in the first section, the first insight, history can be expressed in experience, and here is a case of it again. The pairing of these forces in each social construction of madness can be grounded in the human experience of being caught up in the lived relation of them. Okay, third insight. The third insight is an awareness of loss and tragedy. And this addresses that other pitfall that I had up there as mental illness as only a biological sickness. So where does this idea come from? Mental illness is only biological sickness. Where does this come from? Because of the medical advancements in the last 100, 200 years, modern psychology can be liable to viewing mental illness as only a biological sickness. Even if more and more are becoming aware that alternative paths may help in recovery, medication is often still seen as sort of the primary way to, quote, fix the problem. Now, no doubt there are biological factors in mental disorders. Don't hear me saying that. And no doubt medication can be a very helpful way to help. But to reduce mental illness to only physical causes misses key aspects found in patient experience. So to overcome the pitfall of a reduced understanding of mental illness, we find a fuller sense of loss, as displayed in phenomenological description, and the relation of madness to tragedy, as seen in the archaeological approach, and that's this third insight. Awareness of loss and tragedy. For the sake of time, well, I've got a little bit of time, I'll just quickly go through the phenomenological ideas of loss here. So there's three senses of loss. You have holistic loss as something that affects the whole person. You have functional loss, where that's sort of what we normally think of as the loss, sort of the primary display of the disorder. And then you have personal loss, and this is, again, something where you don't necessarily see that as the disorder, but affects sort of their whole life, right? The way that they live their life and deficit seen in relationships. So the point here is, to understand the loss that is experienced in mental disorder, we need to see the loss as holistic, folding the personal loss, functional loss in this holistic sense of loss, such that the mental disorder will affect the person's entire lived experience. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on the idea of tragedy that comes out of the historical sense. Tragic motifs often found in historical analysis of madness include unexplainable suffering, intense pain, deep anguish, unanswered questions, and incurable wounds. Those are all sort of descriptions, if you look across history, that are given for madness. Summarizing many of these themes toward the end of the history of madness, here's what Foucault writes. How madness makes us face a void, a moment of silence, a question without answer, opening an unhealable wound that the world is forced to address. And that, you see there again, that French word, déchirement, so un déchirement sans réconciliation, a wound without being able to reconcile, unable to be reconciled. Entering the phenomena of madness provokes the world to reflect on its brokenness and to admit that words do not offer satisfactory explanations. It makes us feel as if some wounds will never be healed and some differences will never be reconciled. It acts as a metaphorical weight, resting on a whole community and reminding us that all is not right in the world. Even though they are reflected in different ways over time, these themes of this idea of tragedy keep coming up, and they make something that I call the overarching non-rational. How madness is viewed and treated may change, but its connection to sort of these dark aspects of the non-rational appear to stay the same. The overarching non-rational unifies the diverse traits of the non-rational, which stretch across time, weaving together the common threads that run between them. Foucault calls this presence of the non-rational a massive repetition, an unconditional return. It's a force that we just can't snuff out. Those dark parts are still there, even when we try to hide them. So this idea of the overarching rational might start sounding kind of mythical. You think, did I just sort of leave philosophy into myth or something here? But actually, we can link these ideas to concrete structures. And there's a lot we could talk about, but I'm just going to briefly mention one, which is the area of poverty. So Foucault demonstrates that there's this link between madness and poverty across these ages. And this influence of poverty, which is sort of a social representation, is still present today, to where some psychologists are saying, here's a quote, "Poverty could be one of the most significant social determinants of health and mental health, intersecting with all other determinants." So widening the lens of mental illness to include social structures like poverty allows us to recognize the greater tragic element in mental illness, an element that has not been eradicated over time. This means that the weight of suffering for an individual can sometimes feel disproportionate to an individual's specific diagnosis. The weight of suffering that may be felt, that doesn't seem to connect to this diagnosis. Why is that so heavy? And when we think about the historical place of madness and mental disorder, it helps explain that weight. There's also a theological way of understanding that too, this sort of weight of suffering that's felt. That would be interesting to talk about, but I don't address that here. While medications and biological analysis are certainly helpful ways to address mental disorder, we must expand our view to consider how the loss is affecting a patient in all areas of life, and how the weight of sadness is linked to a larger sense of tragedy. Okay, so we're coming to the end here, and I want to go back to those pitfalls that I mentioned at the beginning and kind of see how I think these two approaches can at least respond or avoid these pitfalls. First of all, the idea of this extreme individualism. Mental disorder must be understood in the light of shared human experiences and in the context of larger historical structures. Thus, it is insufficient to describe it only in terms of an individual's experience. We can relate to those struggling with mental disorders because we can rationally make sense of their experience to a certain extent. They become not isolated individuals, but human beings acting out of common patterns that we share and out of historical structures that are shaping us as well. How about this division? Stark division between normal and abnormal. Because there's this integration of the rational and non-rational, both on historical and experiential level, we can break down the barriers placed between normal and abnormal people. We must not see those with mental disorders as sort of missing the rational or lacking the normal. As opposed to creating separate kinds or categories, we should view the normal and the abnormal on a kind of spectrum, while certainly acknowledging the abnormal has a greater degree of intensity and confusion in the experiences. Last one here, how can we sort of avoid the pitfall of mental illness as only a biological sickness? We recognize that loss due to mental disorder affects the whole person, and this doesn't always make sense purely on a biological level. Furthermore, when placed in relation to the sort of communal sense of tragedy, we recognize that the suffering in mental illness does not just come from a biological cause, but also from social structures that tap into certain tragic forces repeated over time. let's return back to Marilyn that we have here at the beginning. So rather than focusing on controlling her behavior, which is necessary in these situations, right, for safety, for cleanliness, there's another approach, which is certainly more difficult, but perhaps more rewarding, would be to help her dig underneath those behaviors and explore her own experience and background. So some questions that we might ask, and if certainly this isn't going to fix it, right, but to give us a deeper understanding of what's going on. If we think about it from an experience standpoint, what questions could we ask? Well, we could say, what does her bodily behavior indicate about her view of the world? And what are her motivations behind these behaviors? Kind of questions sort of from the experience side. And then from sort of the historical, social side, we might ask, what social and historical structures might be contributing to her illness? How does her relationship with her family sort of play into her own diagnosis here? Tying her behaviors back to common human experiences and placing her disorder in the historical context could allow us to better grasp her dysfunctional actions and maybe help her free herself a little from her burdens. I mentioned that this project isn't just about giving us ways of thinking about mental disorder, but it does sort of point to a bigger picture, and this is honestly my motivation for beginning this whole project, which is just looking at new ways to consider human dignity and human equality. And I don't have time to sort of go into that in detail, but I want you to at least see how it gestures in that way. So think about human equality here. If we're breaking down these distinctions between the normal and the abnormal humans, then we realize that these categories arrive from an inaccurate model of the human and from shifting historical perceptions. So we see this sort of equality that then comes out in the human. And the second thing is thinking about human dignity, right? There's something really unique about the human experience, right? Where we have this interplay between the rational and the non-rational in our actions and experiences. So both in how an individual non-rationally encounters the world and how societies continue to shape institutions according to the rational and the non-rational tells us that there's something unique and then points to the dignity that we find present in humans and lots of diverse human experiences, including mental disorders, but others as well. That is all that I have to share with you today. I just have 2 more slides to put up here. They're both advertisements, if you'll say. So the first one is, if you are interested in these kind of topics, disorder or disability, I am going to be teaching philosophy of disability in the spring. So think about it. It's going to be on Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 1 p.m. But we will explore, I talked a lot about mental disorder here, but sort of even a broader sense of disability in this class, if you have interest in that. And then, as we mentioned at the beginning, I will have my books for sale afterwards on a table. If you are interested in them, they are available. So that is all I have, and we can do some time for questions. Get back to this front slide, and then just say one thing about the question time. Good? Yeah, okay. I just want you to feel freedom for students to ask questions. I think, and faculty, of course, you can ask questions too. But it can be intimidating to ask a question here, but I do really want to hear from you. So if you do have a question as a student, please feel the confidence to ask it. So can go ahead and jump into questions. Yes, Mary.
You talk
on
about,
the microphone.
You talk about poverty and how that is like a link to madness. Mm-hmm. How do you suggest that we, as a society, as a nation, like combat that and then also combat madness in the same sense?
Yeah, so the first step is sort of just a recognition of the way that poverty then sort of leads into things like diagnosis of mental disorders. In terms of how do we combat poverty, I don't think I can sort of answer that in the big sense. But I think that recognizing that even in the sense of poverty too, that there's a tragic element of it that's not just about being fixed, but recognizing, okay, look, there's sort of this brokenness that's present here. That we can't just sort of Band-Aid over, but we need to sort of first see what's the roots of this, where is this sort of coming from, and then that's the same with madness. And we're not just trying to fix madness, but we're trying to see how, look, this actually tells us something about the human condition, and yeah, we want to point people towards greater healing, but often, and this is the thing that's really, really hard to hear when we talk about mental disorders, you have to sort of walk through the dark first. And that's hard. We don't want to do that. We want the fix. But actually, by walking through the dark, facing it first and saying, look, I'm going to look and see how this is really tragic and awful, and I may even feel like it's even more tragic than what I can handle. And yet from that, then I see that's why I have this sense of hope that, of where this is coming from. And I didn't talk about hope much here, but I think the first step is walking through that. Yeah. Yes, Dr. Sfratello.
Thanks for that fascinating stuff. Let me say two things. First, let me try to play devil's advocate in a small way.
Shocking.
So, I'm curious about what you would say to somebody who objects. There's no problem with seeing mental illness as a purely biological problem. We just need better biology, right? And it strikes me, I mean, maybe I'm wrong about this, it strikes me that most patients with mental illness, if offered, medicine that would make the symptoms go away, they would say, sure, sign me up.
That's right.
Somewhat more seriously, I'm wondering, it strikes me that the name that's missing in all of this, and maybe you alluded to this with Nietzsche, the name that's missing in all of this is Freud, right? Like, I mean, isn't it Freud's fundamental thesis by the end of his career? Rationality is just a highly channeled form of irrationality? And I take that as something like your thesis too, right? No? Okay, well, you tell me.
Okay, yeah, great. 2 questions. So the first thing, yes, okay, maybe we just need better biology. Well, if we think that more explanation of sort of what's happening in the body is going to then be satisfying to us, then maybe we go that route. But what we find is that you still have the problem of like cause and effect, right? So if you say, oh, look, now we know it's this particular chemical reaction that is the result in depression, right? Well, why is that chemical reaction happening in the first place, right? Is the depression caused by the chemical reaction that's happening in the brain, or is that then sort of the manifestation of the depression that is the person's experiencing, right? So there's both sort of the lived experience and the social things that are happening that we don't know. So I think by all means, go study biology and learn those things, and they're really helpful. But it's still we're still living outside of that in our world, as of now, biological explanations are not sufficient. They're just not. They don't give the kind of weight to the experiences that people are having a mental disorder. And the second thing about Freud, yes. Well, part of the problem is that Merleau-Ponty kind of liked Freud and Foucault hated Freud. So that's part of the issue there. The reason why Foucault hates Freud is because he says it's deterministic. Ultimately, there's not freedom because you're just determined by these sort of, subconscious things that are in you that then sort of bring it out. And that is not what I want to say here. I want to say that there is this capacity for freedom. Becoming aware of the structures actually then gives you freedom to be free from those structures. And I don't want to say everything's madness, which was Freud goes, well, then it's just all madness. It's just all non-rationality. No, there's that link between the rational and non-rational, right? There's that link there that's present in all of these experiences, and we want to keep that there. We don't want to conflate them entirely. Other questions? Dr. Bungham.
Thank you very much for this talk. I think you did a wonderful job of showing the way in which a certain sort of rationality can be present. I'm thinking of the example of the person who's talking to someone who thinks is next to him.
Yeah.
And of course, there's a sense in which he has a reason for doing what he's doing. It's
Right.
not as if he's doing it completely senselessly. There's something there.
Right.
So we have to see that element of rationality as present. What I'm interested in is your idea that excuse me, we need to break down this divide between the normal and the abnormal, and I want to explore that. So something that came to my mind was the question of enhancement. So an example of this would be something like steroids or things that might go on in athletics.
Yeah.
And generally speaking, I think most people think that that is a bad idea. And that's why it's legislated against, and that's why there's scandals and things like that.
Yeah.
And the idea would be something like, well, what we want to see in athletics is what human beings can do naturally speaking.
Yeah.
And of course, you could take certain drugs, and that might influence your physical movements in certain sort of ways.
Yeah.
But we think there's something wrong with that.
Right.
And that shouldn't be done, even if it can be done.
Yeah.
So my question is something like this. Don't we need something like a criterion for what's normal
Yeah.
in order to make sense of the enhanced performance, which is not so good, versus the natural or normal performance, which is good? If we break down the divide between the normal and the abnormal, can we still make distinctions like that? Why or why not?
Yeah. Yeah, great questions. To the first point, I think of G.K. Chesterton's quote. He says, "The madman is not the one who's lost his reason, the madman who's lost everything but his reason." Because there's actually, that's where I'm talking about, in normal human behavior, you have this sort of link between the rational and non-rational, and when that gets broken, things can actually be quite rational from a certain perspective. So I think that's right. And then to your second point about sort of like, don't we need some kind of distinctions about normal and abnormal? I mean, even to sort of, make decisions about athletics. I mean, even decisions about like, what jobs people can have, or should people be going to classes this semester because of mental illness? I mean, these are sorts of questions that we have to make, practically speaking, and that's why distinctions actually are helpful. And some in phenomenology, postmodernism, they just want to throw the whole thing out. But I mean, we can't talk about our world without using some kind of distinctions. So we have to walk in that really hard tension. We have to say, look, we're going to have some general distinctions here between normal and abnormal, and that's kind of okay because that's how we just normally speak about our world. But it's like a spectrum rather than two categories, right? So if we see it based on a spectrum, that maintains the equality and dignity of the human while not putting them in two separate categories, but still allows us to say, that experience of talking to a person that's not there, that's on the kind of the side of the spectrum that's more extreme. That's, kind of leaning into this non-rational behavior and not having that proper link with the rational. Yeah. Jacinta?
Thank you so much for your presentation.
Yeah.
I guess my question was kind of down the same line of thought as Dr. Bungham's, with that like divide and distinction between rational and non-rational.
Yeah.
My question is more identity. So what about things like, I'm thinking of homosexuality, where it was before seen as non-rational, but
Right.
today we're seeing it more as
Right.
rational.
Yep.
So I guess my question is, the more we put non-rational, rational, like take down those barriers, are we losing our sense of identity of like what we are as human persons, and then we get confused about that?
That's a good question. I think there was a problem with saying homosexuality was non-rational in the first place. I mean, that comes from a wrong understanding of the human to begin with. I mean, that's coming from that sort of modern rationality that wants to say, the primary identity of the human is found in rationality, and anything that deviates, okay, that's less than human. So I think let's go back to what is a human in the first place, right? And if the human is this sort of unity, this idea of like this united being where everything that we do is acted out as a whole, then I think that sort of helps us in at least trying to answer those questions. Now, there might be reasons for saying certain behaviors don't fit with what the human is, but I don't think it should be on that understanding of the human. There's more we could say about that, though. But yeah, thanks for that question. That's good. Yes. This should probably be the last question, right? Yeah. Okay.
This is hard to phrase in a way, but is there any specific factors that you think make certain people more susceptible to madness and or mental illness? Like just specific ones,
Yeah.
rather than others anyway?
Yeah. I mean, definitely. And I mean, the people in psychology who are willing to kind of step out of the just like, oh, it's just something biological in the brain, that's the only reason, to step out of that and start looking at trends like poverty, religion, employment, and family upbringing. I mean, all of these things that contribute, and it's messy. It's really messy. It's a lot easier just to be like, here's the problem, take the medication, you're good, right? So I do have a section in my book where I kind of go through a bunch of those factors that, briefly. But honestly, I feel like someone like Dr. Metalka could probably answer that question better, giving more of the sociological. I'm just trying to say, we need to consider the sociological factors, right? Like, we need to consider these, and I talk about them a little in my book, but then sociology is going to sort of fill in that a little bit more. So, okay, we should probably end. Yes. Yes.
Wonderful.
Thank you.